2 episodes ago, we looked at how MH370 might have been planned from the perspective of a captain who took control of his own plane for the purpose of committing mass murder-suicide. Today, we're going to look at a different scenario. We're going to ask, what if the perpetrator wasn't the captain, but what we called in the last episode an APT, an Advanced Persistent Threat actor? This is a nation-state level perpetrator who has resources and a strategic vision to carry out an ambitious and sophisticated hijack. So given the evidence that we have, given the things we know about the case, how do these things make sense from the perspective of someone who is trying to carry out a specific goal through a specific series of steps? How might they have looked forward to create the evidence that we now have in front of us? Are we able to make a imaginary scenario, a hypothesis, that results in all of the evidence that we have in hand? Or, as we were left after the Zahari planning episode, episode 6 of season 2, it didn't really hang together. It was hard to come up with a coherent goal that would result in the evidence that we have in hand. It's hard to see how someone would carry out that behavior given any kind of comprehensible set of goals. Let's ask that same question now from the other angle, from the perspective of someone who is trying to carry out a strategic objective using the resources of a state actor, an advanced persistent threat actor. Hi everybody, it's Jeff Wise back here with you for episode 8 of season 2 of Deep Dive MH370, the season we're calling Finding MH370. Once again, if you appreciate this podcast, please like, subscribe. You can even join. We now have a join button if you'd like to support us financially as well. Of course, we also have the show page at findingmh370.com. You can support us there. You'll get a weekly newsletter, whether or not you pay for it, and whether you make comments on the Substack at findingmh370.com or leave comments here. My goal is to basically try to hear your questions, your comments, your suggestions, your ideas as much as possible. This is not just me sitting in a chair. This is a collective effort. Science is all about people communicating, sharing ideas, listening, and adjusting their ideas. So please tell me what you think. Tell me what I need to know. Share your expertise with me. One of the really amazing things about the podcast, especially this season, is people reaching out and telling me stuff that I did not know and never would have found out on my own. So, again, thank you, and let's get right into it. Let me talk to you about what I want to talk about today. So let's talk about the world that we're living in circa 2014. Russia finds itself isolated. It is fighting for its soul from its perspective. It has committed itself to waging what's called a new generation warfare against the West, against the United States in particular, but really the entire Western alliance, against liberal democracy, essentially. Putin is trying to shore up internal support, trying to shore up his vision of a greater Russian empire. Now, Russia cannot fight through conventional means. It is too poor, it is too weak, it doesn't have the military resources of its adversaries. It does have one important advantage, though. Its adversaries don't know what it's up to. They don't really understand its objectives and its means. Its adversary is a democracy. A democracy is diffuse. It has many voices. It has many desires. And it has this very open, very chaotic information environment where everybody's talking to everybody else all the time. And nobody really has that kind of laser sharp focus that, say, the Kremlin has, where the Kremlin is able to decide within a very small circle of voices what it wants to do and how it's going to carry it out. So democracy is really unable to grapple with something as particularly single-minded and dangerous as the Kremlin. And so what we're going to imagine for today's exercise is, imagine that the Kremlin has decided that it wants to strike a blow against the West. It wants to create a distraction because it has attempted to take over part of its neighbor, ideally all of its neighbor. It wants to reconquer Ukraine. It's not using it yet. It will later in 2022, but for now it is going to try to take it over, essentially using special operations. It's going to use the military intelligence, and it's going to use subterfuge, little green men, and then as the West reacts to this attempt to overtake Ukraine with horror, Russia will then try to create a distraction. This is the scenario we're laying out today. We're imagining that within the Kremlin, there is a team that is trying to create a distraction, and it wants to draw attention of the world's media away from Crimea. Imagine that the ATP, the Advanced Persistent Threat actor here, is always on the prowl. It's always looking for ideas. It's like a magician. It wants to find a kind of chink in the adversary's perceptual armor. It's trying to look for a gap that it can exploit. It can find either an area where the adversary isn't paying attention, where it has misconceptions or misunderstandings, and it can reach into that gap and exploit it and cause a mystery. It can baffle its adversary. And it's always looking for opportunities to do this. It's always looking for ideas. It's always thinking, how could I make a meal out of this particular thing that's happening in the world? And what I'm going to propose is that in 2009, it had that kind of aha moment with a particular air accident that I've mentioned before in this podcast many times. I'm going to propose that it looked at Air France 447 and it thought to itself, aha, this is very interesting. Because let's talk about what happened to Air France 447. This is a plane that disappeared on the night of July 1st, 2009. The plane had taken off from Rio de Janeiro. It was heading to Paris. Much like MH370, it was a red-eye flight, headed out over the ocean. It left behind one area of air traffic control, and it was, in this case, going to be several hours before it talked to the next air traffic control in Africa. And so during that time, it was being tracked by a little dot on air traffic control screens, but that was just an assumed location. They didn't actually have any actual current data on where the plane was. As it turned out, the plane ran into trouble. It's a little complicated. I'll spare you the details for the current context. But the plane ran into trouble, crashed into the ocean. As it was crashing, an automatic system aboard the plane sent these signals through a system called ACARS to Air France's operations center to tell it that, hey, we're having some problems with some of the machinery. And only later, after the plane failed to show up in Paris, did the Air France people look back and find this data and think, oh no, something went wrong. And they knew from the GPS data that was attached to these signals where all this had happened. And so they were able to start the search from a more or less accurate location of where the plane was. It turned out to be accurate within 5 miles. This plane disappeared and was found within 5 miles of where it had started running into trouble. Now this, of course, was just a pure accident. It had human factors aspects to it. There was machinery that went wrong, and then people misconstrued what was happening and made matters worse instead of better. But the point being, this was what we call an innocent accident. Everything happened as a result of things that just unfolded the way that they unfolded. Nobody was trying to fool or spoof or create false impressions. But I would say that if you were an APT looking at this from afar and watching with wonderment at all of the media frenzy that surrounded this case and all of the attention that it got and how it kind of knocked other things out of the news cycle, you might well say to yourself, how could we do that artificially? How can we reverse engineer the essence of Air France 447 and turn it into something that we can use. Like, let's make a sort of artificial Air France 447. It'll have many of the elements of Air France 447, but it will suit our needs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how Air France 447 could have been reimagined and repurposed and recreated synthetically to create MH370. So let's imagine that you are a sneaky, spooky guy at the Kremlin, and you want to somehow extract the essence of Air France 447. You don't know how, because you need a team of technical people. This is going to require so much specialized expertise that no one person could possibly do it. You need to get ideas from a whole bunch of people. So you gather your team together and you say to them, okay, what we want to do, the essence of what we want to do is take a plane that is on a red-eye flight in the middle of the night. Nobody's paying particular attention to it. We're going to wait till nobody's particularly paying attention. We're going to steal it. We're going to take it, and we are going to have it seem like it's disappearing into the open ocean, like Air France 447 did, except we're going to just have that be an illusion. This is where the magician part of it comes in. We're going to subvert their expectations. We're going to subvert what they think they know, and leave them just a very scant set of clues so that they think they're seeing this plane go one way, and we're going to take our team and extract them to somewhere else. And the world will they'll be completely baffled, and they'll be unable to stop thinking about it. They'll obsess about it. They'll talk about it. It'll be a huge, huge news cycle, and they'll talk about nothing else for a while we can go on and do the stuff that we want to do in Crimea, and nobody's going to give us a hard time. And I think there's another motive too, possibly, which is this is going to be such a crazy, sophisticated magic trick that our counterparts in the CIA, MI6, all of these Western spooks are going to be, if they are smart enough to understand it, and they probably are pretty smart, so they might well figure out what we're doing. They're going to have the fear of God put in them, because they're going to realize what we are capable of, because we can carry something like this out. So, how do we do that? First of all, we need to figure out a way to make something look like it's going somewhere. And it can't be GPS, because GPS is going to tell you exactly where it went. So last episode 7 of season 2, we were talking about how it's possible to lie about where you're located. You can send a lie through GPS and through ADSB, and you can basically say, I'm in location X, Y, and you're actually in location X, A, B. We don't want to do that, though, because if we steal a plane and send it into the ocean, and we send a spoofed GPS location, our adversary is then going to go to that spot and look for it, and it's not going to be there, and the mystery is going to be over really quickly. Actually, something very similar to this happened in the case of MH370, where in April of 2014, the plane, they thought that they had detected the black box pingers at a very specific place in the ocean. And they sent a sub down there to find it, and it wasn't there. And so within a couple of weeks, they realized, oh, okay, this is not what happened. It's not there. So we made a mistake. So we don't want that to happen. We want to give a vague sense of where this plane went. So what can we do that would do that? So they gather all their people together, and they say, we want to send a non-specific signal about where this plane went. And so the team scratches their chins and says to themselves, somebody like reaches up, somebody from the satellite communications side raises their hand and says, you know what? There's a thing we've noticed that happens when a communication satellite is running low on fuel. It starts to wobble, and that creates a problem. In certain kinds of satellite data units, you get a wobble in a certain parameter called the burst frequency offset. And this is a problem. This is something that annoys us. This isn't something that we think of as good. But in this context, it actually could serve us. Because if we understand how the Doppler precompensation algorithm works, and we know that this plane is going to be under a satellite that's wobbly, we can screw around. If we have somebody on board the plane and they get into this particular box that does the Doppler precompensation algorithm, they can change that. They can spoof it to send a signal that would make it seem like it was going, say, north when the plane is actually going south, or vice versa. Okay, that is the gist of the idea. We can make the plane seem like it's going into the middle of the ocean when it's really not. Now, how do we do that? We have to make sure that this data that we're spoofing is the only data that the searchers are going to have. So someone is going to have to get on board this plane and turn off everything. When the plane goes dark, when we seize it, so in this sort of in-between space between air traffic control, we have to turn off everything and then turn back this box that's going to send only this one weird signal. Okay, that's a very not many planes are going to be vulnerable to this. Only a very, very small subset of planes is going to be vulnerable to this kind of action. So what else but that's a good start. Let's start from there. Okay, what else can we do? Okay, so we've already said that we're going to get a plane that has a certain kind of satellite data unit, a Honeywell MCS 6000 satellite data unit that does this Doppler precompensation in a way that we can spoof. We need to make sure there's another thing we have to do. We have to make sure that that the subscription to Inmarsat, the company that provides the satellite service, it's the lowest, cheapest kind of service that they have. It's called Classic Aero. And it has to be Classic Aero because Classic Aero is so bargain basement that they don't include GPS metadata attached to the metadata. And if you pay more for your service, you get the kind that attaches GPS data, and it will tell exactly where the plane is. And again, you have this problem. They're going to know exactly where to look. Okay, what else? Well, one of the guys who's been studying cyberphysical raises his hands and says, you know, I've been studying Western aircraft. I've been looking for we've been thinking about different vulnerabilities in different kinds of Western aircraft, and there's one that really stands out. The Boeing 777 is the most insecure plane that they have. It's new enough that it's fly-by-wire. That means you can control the entire thing from the electronics bay. But it's old enough that they haven't really started to think about things like cybersecurity. And so and it has an unlocked hatch accessible from the passenger compartment, that if you go through this unlocked hatch, you have access to all these computers. You have like root level access. Our guys can build, if you give me some operatives who can get onto the plane, we can build them a box that they can plug in to the AirInc 629 bus, and they'll have root level access. They can do communications, flight controls, SATCOM, whatever you need. And so you need it. So now we've narrowed it down. We need to have a 777 with a Honeywell STU and an Inmarsat subscription that's the cheapest, Classic Aero. Oh, and by the way, if we're going to do this spoof, it's going to work best if it's near the equator. So we need a flight that's near the equator in the middle of the night. But if we have all of these things, and we can get a guy, maybe a couple guys, onto the plane, and then we can really pull off something really crazy. And so they look around the globe. Oh, and there's another thing, which is that the way this mirror works, the way that if you can spoof the BFO data from the satellite, you'll make the plane look like it's going north when it's really going south, or vice versa. So, and you need to do it on the equator, and so you're basically going to be creating an artificial mirror route. You really want that mirror route to be going into some ocean somewhere, some ocean that doesn't have a lot of radar. Nobody's really looking or paying attention. An open, empty ocean. So pull out your chart, look at the map. What do you see? Well, what you see is that if you start in the northern Indian Ocean, like the Andaman Sea area, and you go, imagine having this false route going south into that open ocean of the Indian Ocean. You can have a mirror route that goes north over a lot of countries that don't really have much radar, and you wind up in Kazakhstan, where we have a bunch of bases. So plenty of runways for you to land at. So now we have a long list of criteria that we can pull off this really crazy scheme if we have a flight that matches all of these different criteria. And we get the intern to look through the internet and see if there's a flight that matches all the things that we need to have. And we go to have some vodka, we come back, and the intern is ready. The intern says, yes, there is a flight that matches what you're talking about. In fact, there's a whole lot of, it's an airline, Malaysia Airlines, operates 777s. They had a lot of financial troubles, so they subscribe to the cheapest level of Inmarsat. And they fly over the Andaman Sea. And so you can, at that moment, you could take it, get your guy into the electronics bay, spoof the SDU, boom, boom, you're done. You got a plane that looks like it's going south, and it really goes, it's going north to Kazakhstan. Great. But there's one part. There's one part that doesn't make sense. Remember, we started out this exercise by saying we're going to look at the evidence we have and think, how could this be the result of someone making a plan? And in this case, if the plan is to steal a plane and make it go and make it seem to vanish into the ocean when you're really making your team escape to a different location, why would you do the turn back at Agari? How do you explain that? This is the same problem we had with Zaharie when we were trying to imagine how Zaharie would have planned his escapade. Why didn't he just go straight? If he was trying to commit the world's most undetectable mass murder suicide, why would he fly over a Malaysian Air Force station and through all this radar coverage? It doesn't make a lot of sense from a pilot hijack scenario. And at first, it doesn't really make a lot of sense from an APT hijack scenario either. Why are these clever people going to have the plane go dark and then immediately, having done this super sneaky thing where nobody's paying attention to them, immediately fly over an Air Force base where presumably they would be seen? And it is a crazy aspect of this case, and I think it is hard to kind of explain. However, this is my proposal. The idea of the turn back at Agari, going dark and doing the 180 at Agari, is that you've left air traffic control. Nobody is looking at you at that moment. There's nobody who can pick up the phone and say, hey, something's going on here, something funny is happening. If you would have to know that nobody was really paying attention to the primary radar at that moment. At least they weren't paying enough attention that they would scramble fighters or just generally sound the alarm and say, hey, everybody, something really weird is happening. Get on the phone, put on your pajamas, take off your pajamas, put on your clothes, go down to the office. We have to deal with this. I think that we have to imagine that whoever carried out this plan thought that that passing over the Air Force Base would not cause any panic in the real moment at the time, but it would only be noticed, and would definitely be noticed the next day, would be seen afterwards. And having been seen would essentially create the narrative. We talked in the last season about how magicians set up tricks. And the magician doesn't just make the rabbit disappear or the ball disappear or the hoop pass over the string or whatever. He doesn't just do the amazing thing. He first has to lead you along a path. He has to set a default narrative. He has to make you think. He has to make you assume something. And so my proposal here is that the turn back at Agari and the flight over Butterworth and up the Malacca Straits in full view of all this primary radar has the specific intention of setting the expectations of the investigators who would follow later. Because what it looks like is, here is somebody taking this plane. This isn't an accident. This isn't a plane where people get incapacitated by smoke and the plane flies off into the South China Sea and runs out of fuel and crashes out of sight of our radar. This is clearly somebody doing something. And the perpetrator that it is implying, necessarily, if you think about it for 2 seconds, is the captain. So I think that I'm proposing that the reason for the turn back at Agari is to set a narrative that will then guide the investigators down the garden path as you're going to lay this trail of breadcrumbs that will subsequently make sense. It will make sense from the perspective of that default narrative that you've established. And so what you do is, having turned off all of the electronics and then flown at the Malacca Straits in full view of the primary radar, you wait until you're out of radar range, then you turn north, and then you turn on the satellite data unit and start creating your false trail of breadcrumbs. While you fly north, your mirror image flies north into the open ocean. And parenthetically, we do know that the plane turned north after it left Malaysian radar coverage, because the act of turning seems to have increased its apparent surface area enough that it created one last blip. And the location of that blip in relation to the first Inmarsat ping tells us that the plane turned to the northwest. I think that was a mistake. I think that was inadvertent on part of the perpetrators, if this scenario was correct. So the two things that we had the hardest time explaining when we were looking at the incident from the perspective of Zahari planning it were the turnback and the reboot of the SDU. Those are things that, from the perspective of an APT, are actually just an inherent part of the plan. And specifically, the reboot of the SDU is maybe something that the planners would look at and say, we actually wish we didn't have to do this. We wish that there was a more organic way that these signals could be produced, because it is actually the biggest problem with this scenario from the perspective of the perpetrators, is that it's your tell. This is the giveaway. The reboot of the SDU is the giveaway that the pilot didn't do it. Because as we've seen, it's almost impossible to explain how a pilot could reboot the SDU. He wouldn't know how to do it. He wouldn't want to do it. And he would derive no benefit from it. So, and from something I've been saying for a very long time, is that the reboot of the SDU is easy to explain from the perspective of an APT scenario, a spoof scenario, and it's almost impossible to explain from a pilot suicide scenario. The other thing that's really hard to explain from the Zahari perspective is the bizarre behavior at the end. We've seen how, in order to match the BFO data, if Zahari took the plane, he would have had to put it into a steep dive, then changed his mind within the span of about 30 seconds, put it into a glide, and then change his mind again and crash it into the ocean to kill himself. That's what seems like a bizarre sequence of events. Possible, to be sure, but very strange. And kind of a retcon that you sort of tell yourself at the end, after you've searched the seabed and hadn't been able to find the wreckage, that something like weird like this must have happened. That is, I think, a huge flaw from the Zahari scenario perspective, but it actually makes perfect sense from the spoof scenario, because the BFO data doesn't have that physical meaning anymore. The BFO data is just the hallucination of a box. And so it doesn't tell you really anything about what the plane is doing. It's, for the most part, it's just trying to give you the false impression of a plane going south. The thing at the end is just noise. Okay. So in my scenario, the reason that the plane was stolen was as a distraction for the Western public to get its mind off of Crimea, and maybe also to serve as a kind of a warning, a show to the Western intelligence agencies that they were capable of really sophisticated, really ruthless actions that would not only be incomprehensible to the Western public, but inconceivable. Like, I think that from my own experience of trying to explain this idea to people, people are like literally incapable of understanding this idea. It is outside of their capacity to understand. And so if I think Western intelligence had understood what happened to this plane and tried to say, hey, Russia did this thing, a very skeptical public would have said, you're insane. because that's what they said to me. They said that I was insane. Final point I want to make is that people say, why would Russia want to attack a Malaysian plane? And the reason that this particular plane was targeted is that it had this very rare combination of characteristics that would be necessary for this particular hack, namely this desire to reverse engineer Air France 447, could only be carried out with planes that had this particular set of characteristics. There weren't that many. You needed a 777 with an SDU that was built by Honeywell, with the lowest level of Inmarsat service, a starting point near the equator, with a mirror route that lay over an open ocean, and an actual route that led you home over countries that didn't have radar. That's a very narrow set. Oh, and all of this, by the way, both that route home and the route over the ocean had to lie entirely under the coverage area of a single wobbly Inmarsat satellite. So for Captain Zaharie Ahmad Shah and the 200-odd other people on board the plane with him, it was just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay, that's all I have for you today. It was a bit of a strange journey. I hope it made sense. Tell me what you think. Once again, please hit like, subscribe. If you give comments, that actually is good for the algorithm. It helps the algorithm tell other people that this conversation is happening here. And again, let me just draw a line under this. I now have this thing called join. You can join and get a little sticker. It's not much, but it does show me that you appreciate the podcast and want to help out. It is very much appreciated. So that's all I have for you today. So I will say my usual thing, which is don't ever stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. So long. See you next time.